At the Advent Cafe, our Wednesday evening service this past week, I was very fittingly also talking about this parable of the prodigal son. And after the service, my children came stampeding toward me with some very urgent matters to discuss with me. It centered around the cookies at the snack table. And both of them felt that they needed another cookie from the snack table. Both of them had reasons why they deserved another cookie from the snack table. Each of them had some reporting to do on the other about why their sibling did not deserve cookies from the snack table. And each of them had been taking a ledger of who had had more cookies at the snack table. Jesus is perhaps never more easy to relate to than when he uses this sibling rivalry as a parable for telling us something about how God operates. And what we find in this parable is that there are all kinds of entry points that invite us to relate to the characters in this story. So maybe as a parent or maybe as a sibling yourself, maybe you have had experience with how sibling rivalry works. And it's not just kids, is it? There are all kinds of happy, well-adjusted, dearly beloved children who nonetheless get locked into being convinced that somebody other than me is the favorite child. Maybe you don't have experience with sibling rivalry, but maybe you have seen in how we relate to one another that we can all too easily get locked into comparisons and competition with each other. Maybe if you're taking a moment of quiet recollection and honesty, maybe it's the prodigal son, the not-so-good son, that you can relate to. Maybe you know what it is to have made choices in your life that separate you from those that you love, those who love you. Maybe you need to hear this promise this morning that God will find a way of bringing us home. Maybe you can relate to the Father, who, let's face it, loves pretty foolishly. Maybe you know what it is to be so glad to see a loved one return to you, that you don't pause to consider whether that loved one is actually sorry for what they've done, whether they're going to hurt you again. Maybe you rub up against the fundamental injustice of this parable. Because as far as moral teaching goes, this parable kind of stinks. It almost seems like a recommendation against moral, upright, God-fearing, church-going living. Because, hey, if we all get the same reward at the end, and maybe the people who haven't made such good decisions even get a better reward, then why should we bother? And once we come to the rub of this parable, then we're invited to go deeper. Because in fact, this isn't a parable about how God's reward system does or doesn't work. We're invited to see this parable as part of a whole of Jesus' ministry. And we can see in Jesus' life, in his death, in his resurrection, that Jesus continues continually focuses the good news on reaching out a hand to draw in those who are excluded, to draw in those who have been left out, to find their place in God's kingdom, and therefore also to find their place in loving and serving and offering in the human relationships that are at the heart of this life. That is where Jesus continually comes back to. Now, a lot of his ministry is focused around reaching out to those who are excluded through no fault of their own. Those who are hungry, those who are poor, diseased, possessed, dispossessed, mentally ill, sick. But in this parable today, Jesus makes it clear that there is also a need to reach out to those who are excluded through the choices that they have made. We find in this first son, the prodigal son, the lost son, that he takes advantage of his father. He goes off and lives the high life on somebody else's dime. And it seems like he is just grabbing at all that life has to offer. And he ends up excluded through his own choices, which inevitably lead us, when we put ourselves and our own pleasure and our own need above any other consideration, inevitably we are led to this same place as the prodigal son. We are cut off from those who love us. We are insatiably hungry, and we are looking for our way back home. But the other son is also excluded in this parable. The good son, the faithful son, is also excluded through his own choices. He can't stop pointing fingers at the bad choices that others are making. He can't stop comparing himself to those who are around him. And he feels this fundamental injustice at all of the good choices that he sees himself making in contrast to all the bad choices he sees his brother making, and yet he thinks that as the scales are balanced out, all of the affection, all of the love, all of the gifts, all of the blessings go to his brother. And here he is, sitting on his front porch of his house while this party is going on. This amazing celebration of blessing and life and gratitude. And he's sitting on the front porch sulking, locked into his own bitterness and jealousy. A friend of mine, a really good priest in the Diocese of Algoma, Jake Hoyle, was reflecting on this parable this week. And he talked about the invitation to hear this story from the perspective of the third son. The third son who is actually telling us this story. The third son who shows us what a life of service looks like. How to serve our Father, not because of the rewards that it will get us, but because that capacity to love and to be joined to God's life is built into the very fabric of our being. This third son shows us that that is what a fulfilled and filled and joyful human life looks like. Joined into the loving service offered by God. This third son relentlessly invites us to find our place as a beloved child at God's table. Whether we have been left out by the choices somebody else has made, or whether we have been left out by our own choices, or whether we are left out by our discomfort around who else we find gathered at God's banquet. I want to bring this parable to bear on some happenings in the wider church this week. I have talked before from this pulpit about a motion before our National Anglican Church this summer as it meets in Richmond Hill, the General Synod. A motion to expand the definition of marriage to include faithful, committed, same-gendered partnerships. Well, this week there was a statement released from the Canadian bishops who had gathered together last weekend. And they let the wider church know that this motion will be defeated this summer by the authority of the bishops. Now, they made it clear that they were not of one mind on this subject. Our own bishop, Bishop Michael, released a statement immediately to express his great sadness at these words and to stand in solidarity with the LGBTQ community in our church who will be so hurt by this decision. In our wider church, I see throughout this week those dynamics of exclusion taking place on so many different levels. There are certainly people on both sides of this conversation who are pretty quick to point fingers and to claim the moral high ground in this conversation. There is across the national church a sense of an opportunity lost. That this summer we will gather around God's table and we have the opportunity to listen to one another, to hear one another's stories and experiences, to pray together and to journey forward together. And that somehow this trumping of perhaps fear and authority has short-ended that communion. The voice that has resonated most with me this week is from a friend of mine, a colleague of mine. I'm the chair of the worship committee for General Synod this summer, and a member of our committee, a very valued and gifted member of our committee, resigned this week in light of this statement from the House of Bishops. And he resigned with these very simple words. He said he has been in a committed, faithful, same-gendered marriage for the past 30 years. And he said, I just can't go one more time to hear a conversation take place as if I'm not in the room. The church, at times, has the amazing capacity to lift up for us the best possibility of what our human lives can look like, can be. And sometimes our church instead lifts up for us just how broken our human relationships can be, how hard it can be for us to figure out how to make this journey together. There's a lot of hurt across our church this week, and I expect going forward. And yet, if that can teach us anything, it's to center ourselves once again in the voice of the third Son. That third Son who invites us to keep coming back to God's table, to recognize that each of us has a place reserved for us around God's table, that we can claim our place at God's table as a beloved child. The thing that we always have to figure out, however, we have to figure out the grace of accepting who else is on God's guest list. Amen.